Good day to you, friends. My name is Ken Ogasawara. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Welcoming the stranger is a teaching that MCC holds dear. It's an integral part of our history, beginning with resettling tens of thousands of fellow Mennonites following World War II, and over the years to expand that welcome to all peoples who have been forced to flee their homes. This call is a deeply biblical one. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 34 says, "The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners once in Egypt. I am the Lord your God." The Apostle Paul writes in Hebrews 13, verse 2, "Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it." And of course, Jesus himself says in Matthew 25, verse 35, "For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me." My two guests today have had the privilege of welcoming the stranger as part of their jobs, but led by very different motivations and coming at the work in very different ways. You'll hear their stories weave throughout this episode. But first, a word from our sponsor. Undercurrents is sponsored by Kindred Credit Union. Kindred helped to get Undercurrents off the ground back in 2020 and have been a faithful supporter all these years. Kindred is all about helping you make peace with your money through real human advice and by using money as a force for good in your community. Go to kindredcu.com to learn more.
My name's Kaylee Perez. I serve with MCC as the Global Migration and Resettlement Strategic Initiatives Lead. That is a mouthful. But it basically means that I'm working to connect MCC's global work on migration, looking at ways that through strategic initiatives, we can strengthen the impact that we're having on the needs of migrants globally.
The needs of migrants globally are huge. But first, some definitions. Migrants refer to anyone who is on the move, moving from one place to live or work in another place. Under this broad umbrella, there are a number of other categorizations, including immigrants, who move to another country by choice for work or studies or family reunification, and the group most relevant to this episode, and to MCC, refugees. Refugees are those who have been forced to flee to another country due to violence, conflict, or persecution.
Of the percentage of forcibly displaced persons in the world, what we know is that 42.5 million are refugees. And what we're also seeing on a global scale is so an increase in the need, more refugees, a dismantling of the global system due to cuts in funding to major organizations like the UN Refugee Agency, the International Organization for Migration. We're seeing shifts in policy in multiple countries where fear is being spread and borders are being closed. And so there are fewer and fewer countries who are willing to open their doors to let refugees in.
I asked Kaylee from her seat at 30,000 feet, seeing the big picture, how does refugee resettlement look now in Canada? And has it changed in recent years?
Public opinion has swayed over the years. And in the past 10 years that I've been in this program, I've seen it ebb and flow. When I first started back in 2015, that was a moment of significant Canadian response to the Syrian crisis, where hundreds of thousands of Canadians were like, we want to do something. How can we get involved? And there was very strong public support for refugee welcome. But post-COVID, it's been challenging. And we've seen politicians abroad spreading lies to turn neighbors against neighbor. And so that's part of the current environment and the struggle that we're seeing right now.
This is certainly playing out in the comments section. Even on MCC's own posts. Here are just a few comments MCC has gotten on our own social media platforms promoting refugee sponsorship. And I'm warning you that this language is disturbing. One person wrote, "Stop bringing these people, my God." Another said, "What does Canada gain by bringing these third world Africans?" And another wrote, Mass deportation now is the only solution. And there are many more.
So in terms of current political and public discourse on newcomers and refugees, I think what we're seeing is that refugees and immigrants are being blamed for systemic and structural issues that are not their fault. The other thing is that we have some market research that was done in July of 2025. And what it showed is that Canadians are actually reluctant to openly align with strongly anti-immigrant messages. They're reluctant to this. There are more Canadians who support than oppose immigration and believe in the positive roles of immigrants in Canadian society. So 66% actually support versus 20% opposing. This is literally stats from just last summer. So what we know is that the majority of Canadians are they're in support of refugee welcome, and many of them are in this movable middle space where they don't exactly know what they think about this issue. It's easy to get confused because of the conflation of issues and refugees and immigrants being blamed for things that are not their fault. But when you get to the core of it, do you actually believe that Canada should be welcoming refugees?
Nearly 50 years ago, the answer was a resounding and powerful yes. Canada was on the cusp of a new era that saw us opening our doors to refugees in particular in a big way. And MCC played a unique and important part in a major milestone moment for Canada and the world, responding to a refugee crisis in the 70s and 80s that was arguably the most dramatic and devastating since the Second World War. And it all centered around a piece of policy that, for the first time in the world, enabled citizens to officially sponsor refugees and help them resettle them into their new country. And I happened to get the opportunity to sit down with the man who was responsible for this program.
I got to Vienna just as the Russian tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia.
This is Mike Malloy, retired Foreign Service officer, adjunct research professor at Carleton University, and former Canadian ambassador to Jordan, among many other things. He has seen a lot over the course of his career.
And long story short, over the next 8 weeks, we moved 6,000 people out. We survived a civil war.
Mike was the man ultimately tasked with designing the world's first private sponsorship of refugees program.
In this period while I'm director of refugee policy, we're working away on all these different provisions. And we know that there is a section which says you can create rules for alternate rules for refugees or the sponsorship of relatives. It's all put in one little tiny clause, and that's what they give us. Okay, you can do this, so do it.
When Mike brought together his small team, he gave them a very specific mandate, drawing on his experience evacuating Asians out of Uganda during the notorious dictatorship of Idi Amin in the 1970s.
I said, when I was in Uganda and we were having to make decisions on the spot, 25 or 30 cases a day, against imminent danger and all sorts of other things happening around us, one of the best moments of any day was when they hand us an application and there's a telegram there from somebody in Sarnia saying, if you let in Ahmed so-and-so, we will look after that person. And I said, that liberated us. And I said, I want the system to liberate our officers. It will liberate them from having to fret about, is there somebody who's going to care for this person? I said, so when you design that, that's got to be in the front of your mind. The processes have to be sufficiently rigorous in terms of making sure people do what they promise to do on behalf of these people, and what do we do if they don't. But we want the officers to have absolute confidence that when that sponsorship comes through, it's gold.
All the while, the headlines coming out of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia are horrifying Canadians. And Canadian Mennonites are advocating to their leaders and to MCC that they wanted to be able to support the refugees somehow, some way. Remember that the generation of Mennonite refugees who were resettled out of Europe during World War II are now firmly established Canadians who want to pay the kindness and welcome that they received forward to the boatloads of refugees fleeing Southeast Asia. Bill Jansen, then director of MCC's new Ottawa office, took this mandate and reached out to the federal government, where Mike Malloy and his team were quietly building a groundbreaking program that would save hundreds of thousands of lives.
We hadn't had anything to do with the Mennonites up to that point. And we get this message out of the blue from them. Could you send us 100 or 200 copies of your flyer that explains the thing? So we sent them off. And right after Christmas, they get in touch with us and say, hey, we want an agreement. We are willing to take liability on behalf of our congregations. If something goes wrong, we, not you, the government, we will fix it. We will intervene. We will do what's necessary. And in return, we want you to make it easy for our congregations to sponsor. A letter from us should be all the proof you need that this congregation is going to be resourced and trained. It's not generally known, but our deputy minister, our assistant deputy minister said, well, if they want to play this game, dump everything off them, including the cost of language training, including the cost of skills upgrading. So Bill Jansen on the Mennonite side and Gordon Barnett, who was a professional negotiator for the government but was working for the immigration at the time, were told, okay, go off and make it happen.
Now, normally in negotiations, there's a lot of back and forth, a tug of war, with the end result being somewhere in the middle. But Bill Jansen didn't negotiate that way. He didn't play tug of war. He dropped the rope. He told Gordon Barnett, sure, our congregations will do everything necessary to resettle these refugees to their new home. We'll do all of that. We'd be happy to.
But it was love at first sight between those two guys. Gordon was so impressed by Bill's absolute sincerity. But Gordon's conscience began to prick him because we had billions of dollars for language training. We had networks of programs all over the country for skills. So he goes back and sees our immediate boss and says, there are things we can do better and we have the machinery. Why would we dump it on these people? Well, the assistant deputy minister was not somebody who was easily talked off. But anyways, the two of them went and got him to agree that, yes, we would take language training and skills training off the table. That the federal government would look after that. So anyways, I guess we signed the deal in April. And as Bill tells it, the phone began to ring the next day. By the end of May, 1,200 refugees had been sponsored. So a month later, essentially.
As my colleague Jason Dewick wrote in an excellent piece published in 2019 called Consider It Resettled, quote, the signing of the master agreement marked an extraordinary moment in MCC's history. While there had been broad agreements in place to support refugee resettlement between MCC and the Canadian government, this deal formed the foundation for how modern faith communities directly support those seeking refuge. Shortly after its signing, dozens of national church bodies and dioceses across Canada signed virtually identical agreements. Over the following 18 months, half of Canada's 600 Mennonite and Brethren in Christ churches sponsored some 4,000 refugees for resettlement to Canada. End quote. All the while, the trust between federal civil servants and the Mennonites continued to deepen in unique ways.
Let me jump ahead a bit. So then comes the big push, and all of a sudden we're talking about 50,000 refugees. A minimum of 21,000 have to be privately sponsored. When you're moving 50,000 people from halfway around the world on flights going to 2 different reception centers, coming out of 9 different countries, which was the case, things can go wrong. The Mennonites became our management consulting mechanism. We quickly learned that if they came to us and said, something not quite right here, we would investigate. Well, my goodness, that's it. So they and the Christian Reformed Church became our feedback mechanism. And that required a great deal of trust. And they never misled us, and we never failed to understand and take action on anything they did. So it became a very deeply embedded relationship of trust that that was unlike anything we had with anybody else.
It's been over 4 decades since Mennonites, and Canada as a whole, took the plunge and opened their doors. But was it worth it? What are the long-term effects of this social experiment? If only there was some way to know. If only there was a comprehensive academic study of the stories of those refugees, which was then compiled into a rigorous yet page-turning publication. Well, Mike Malloy and his colleagues created just such a book called Hearts of Freedom. Featuring over 170 interviews with former refugees who fled the Indochina Wars in the 1970s and 80s, the book is a combination of historical preservation, gripping storytelling, and a profoundly comprehensive examination of the long-term effects of one of the largest refugee resettlement projects in Canadian history. I asked Mike what was the motivation behind such a massive undertaking, which includes a documentary, a curriculum, another book called Running on Empty, and a website, heartsoffreedom.org, which contains videos of interviews, photos, and much more.
Well, partly we wanted to understand how Canada reacted, but mostly we wanted to understand better why it was so many people risked their lives and so many people lost their lives. 1 in 3, we figured, died trying to get away. What is it that pushes people, knowing that, to take their kids and get on a boat that's 10 meters long and head out across one of the roughest seas in the world, the South China Sea? What is it that's pushing them to take that chance, knowing you and your kids may drown? You may be killed by pirates. You may get lost and die of thirst or starvation. You may get overturned in a storm. You may get sent off in the wrong direction because the guy driving the boat doesn't know his business. All sorts of things. So we wanted then we wanted, and having gone through that, arrive in a country like Canada where you've never seen snow, different language, different food. How is it that so many of them, 50 years on, have done so well? And how is it that 50 years on, they've managed to come to think of themselves as Canadians?
I want to quote just one part of Hearts of Freedom that speaks to this love of Canadian values, and it's a passage about Tran Duc Chi, who is described in the book as, quote, a well-spoken gentleman in his mid-50s. The interview was in English, which he speaks very well, and he also speaks French, which he learned during his early years in Quebec. Here was Tran's experience with becoming Canadian, and I quote, he said, "From the beginning, Canada was nice. It was fantastic. I started to fall in love with Canada, and that feeling made me feel guilty." He felt that he was betraying Vietnam, his original love. It was during a math class that he thought of infinity and considered that infinity divided by 2 still remains infinity. That's when he realized that he could love both Vietnam and Canada equally. He said, "I felt that this was my adopted country, that I loved wholeheartedly, and that was okay. I didn't have to abandon my previous love for Vietnam." End quote. This is something that came out in the interviews over and over again. The gratitude and love for a Canada that welcomed them and showed them life-saving compassion when they needed it most.
My colleague Peter says they have the purest Canadian values of anybody in the country. Because as one of them told us, you don't have any notion about how valuable freedom is unless you've lost it and you've managed to regain it.
Canada has unquestionably benefited from choosing welcome over the decades. In our current climate, our communities and political leaders need reminding of this fact. This is why MCC, along with many other organizations across Canada, has partnered with the Canadian Council for Refugees on a campaign called We're Better Together. We're Better Together is a long-term public opinion shifting campaign to grow refugee welcome. For MCC, refugee sponsorship is a long-term peace-building initiative that not only has a proven track record, as Mike has said, but also one that is at the root of our faith. And in times like this, sharing this good news with our community is so important.
What you're describing and seeing on social media is what happens when people are afraid, and fear polarizes to extremes. But what we know from what the research has shown is that that's not where the majority of people land. They're not in the xenophobic space, which is what the comments show, but that's not where the majority of people fall. So in terms of how we respond to that kind of negative sentiment, our goal is not to try to convince the people on the opposite extreme that this is something that they should be thinking about. Because if you think about how do people change their mind, these dynamics happen in the context of relationships of trust. And so this is why the campaign's approach is really to focus on equipping our existing supporters, our existing base, with tools and resources to be able to reach the people in their lives who they have relationship or could begin to build relationship with, to say, hey, what do you think about this issue? And maybe we can learn together.
Right now on this planet, one of the most valuable of all things is a resettlement placement offer for one refugee. It's something that Canada can do that few others can or will do, and the need has never been greater. You can't take them all, but we never lose with refugees. They have repaid the country over and over and over again by their ingenuity and by their love of this country. Refugees have nowhere to go. They have to plant themselves here, and they have to get on with the business of learning how to live in this country and making sure that their kids take full advantage of what's available here for people who are willing to work hard for it. And so why is it important? I think it's more important than ever at this stage that when the world is getting so much darker, that we retain what one of the things that makes us special, which is a willingness to keep the doors open.
Recently, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees crunched some data from Statistics Canada and other sources, and here are their main takeaways. Refugees strengthen Canada's workforce. They are twice as likely as Canadian-born workers to be employed in manufacturing and utilities, and a larger percentage of refugees work in health and skilled trades. These are significant portions of our workforce. Refugees arrive ready to work. The majority arrive in their prime working years. This helps balance Canada's aging population and supports long-term economic stability. They also found that refugee incomes rise steadily. In 10 years since arriving, refugee median employment earnings grow by 31.5%. And finally, refugees are committed to Canada. More than 80% choose to become Canadian citizens within 10 years of arrival, reflecting a profound desire to participate fully in the country's civic and democratic life. The statistics are fine, and for those who need it, the data are a sound justification for showing life-saving welcome to those who have lost everything. But for Kaylee, her motivation is personal and faithful.
Yeah, I mean, I do this work in large part because of the forced migration stories in my family. I was born in Canada, but my father was born in Cuba. My mother was born in Colombia to a Colombian mother and Palestinian father. So there are stories of forced migration that exist. I also grew up attending a faith community that was largely composed of refugees and immigrants who had come from all different parts of Latin America. And so that's been my community here in Canada my entire life. And this work, the commitment to it, is my own lived experience, the beauty that I see, the strength that I see refugees and immigrants bringing to the community that I live in, as well as the faith call. at MCC, the call to welcome the stranger, the reality that we are all image bearers of Christ. For a long time, I used to think of that as, okay, if I can see the image of Christ in you, then it'll make it easier for me to love you. And what I'm looking for, what I realized I was doing is what I was often looking for was connecting points or sameness, some element of we are the same in this way. But have recently realized that it's actually not about looking for sameness. It's about desiring the newness that comes when you get to build relationship with someone who's different from you. Actually longing to be decentered and to be open and realizing my way is not the best way. And when I actually am excited to learn something new from you, the beauty and the strength that comes from that is significantly transformational. Like, I have seen this over and over through the relationships that get built through the private sponsorship program here in Canada. And I just think that is more of what our country needs right now. The response to fear is proximity. When you do life with people who initially you didn't know, who you were kind of scared of, they're not so scary anymore. And it really gets at the heart of so much of fear, so much of the xenophobic rhetoric. At the root of it is fear. And how do we respond to that? With love. And this is a practical way to do that.
The stories we've heard today really highlight the power of our 3 levels of reflection and action that we've been sharing at the end of the episodes. We've been given the opportunity to change our perspective. We've certainly seen how this work of refugee sponsorship is relational. And how do we now relate differently to newcomers in our community and in our lives? And we've definitely seen the power of how system change in the past has changed our country for the better. I will admit, though, that for me anyway, it can be too easy to become apathetic or cynical. What good does it do to sign this petition or call my MP? But Mike, speaking as one who has been on the receiving end of these calls, has this to say about it.
All that stuff sharpens us up. You know, the arguments we have with civil society about what's the right way to go challenges our received notions and changes us as civil servants and as politicians.
That encourages me. We, as citizens, as constituents, have a role to play in shaping our society. The question is, what kind of society do we want to be? I, for one, want to see us continue our legacy as Canadians and Mennonites of keeping the door open for refugees, to welcome the stranger. Big thank you to Mike Malloy for sharing his story with me, of which I was only able to include a small part. He definitely has a memoir's worth of stories to share. I also want to give thanks to Mike's colleagues who organized the Hearts of Freedom project, including Peter Duchinski, Colleen Lundy, Alan Moskovich, and Stephanie Petsame-Stoby. Please check out heartsoffreedom.org, and I'll also leave a link to an episode about Hearts of Freedom from Artifactuality, a podcast of the Canadian Museum of History. It's hosted by Kim Thuy, who herself was a refugee from Vietnam, and includes sharing from Stephanie Petsame-Stoby, who is co-author and organizer of the Hearts of Freedom project. It's powerful, moving, and well-produced. Thanks to my friend and colleague Kaylee Perez and the entire migration and resettlement team at MCC. Your work is life-saving and gives us the opportunity to truly live into our faith and values. I'll include a link to the Better Together campaign in the show notes. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Rate and review Undercurrents wherever you listen to podcasts, including on YouTube now. And please share with your friends. Use the discussion guide on our website to facilitate a Sunday school hour at church. And don't forget to tell me if you have. You can write to me at podcast@mcco.ca. Undercurrents is sponsored in part by Kindred Credit Union, and this episode was produced with help from Kristen Kong, artwork by Jesse Bergen, and theme music by Brian McMillan. My name is Ken Ogasawara. Have a great rest of your day.